Welcome to From Manuscript to Ministry, created and produced by Elder William Moore, the podcast where faith meets the written word. Each week, your hosts David and Martha dive into powerful, self-published books by Christian authors who are boldly using their God-given voices to impact the kingdom. Whether you're an aspiring writer, a reader seeking spiritual growth, or a ministry leader in search of authentic resources, this is your space to be inspired, encouraged, and equipped. Let's explore today's featured book and uncover the life-changing message behind the manuscript.
I want you to picture something for me. Just put yourself back in the exact physical space you were in the last time. A major plan of yours, completely, undeniably defeated.
Oh man, that is a heavy way to start.
Right, but think about the physiological reaction, because it is not just a mental realization. It is a biological event.
Absolutely, your body reacts before your brain even catches up.
Exactly. Your stomach drops, your chest gets tight, the amygdala in your brain just starts firing off these alarm bells, flooding your entire system with cortisol.
Because your brain literally perceives this failure as an existential threat. It thinks you were in physical danger.
Yeah. Maybe it was a career trajectory you had mapped out perfectly, or a relationship you thought was rock solid.
Or just a personal goal you poured your absolute heart and soul and probably your savings into.
Yes, and then suddenly the floor just vanishes, and you are left standing in the rubble of your own expectations.
It is a moment of profound, breathtaking failure. Or a crushing regret.
Or just deeply heavy disappointment. Now, I want you to be really honest with yourself about the talking about. How did you label that moment in your mind?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right, because when the immediate panic faded and the dust settled, what terminology did you use to define it? Did you call it a dead end?
Did you look at those broken pieces and just decide, well, this is a final, inescapable defeat?
Exactly. Because the vocabulary we use to label these moments entirely dictates our biological and spiritual response.
Which is arguably the most crucial pivot point in human psychology. I mean, human nature, driven by that exact evolutionary survival mechanism you just described, probably begs us to label those moments as the end of the road.
It really does. It just feels safer to give up.
Right. We are structurally wired to perceive pain, disruption, and any sudden loss of momentum as definitive indicators that we need to stop. We want to retreat, curl into a ball, and accept it.
Because our brains want to conserve energy. And failure is incredibly expensive energetically.
What we are unpacking today is a radical, highly disruptive, and honestly completely counterintuitive perspective shift on the nature of adversity itself.
And that is our mission for today's deep dive. We are going to completely dismantle that natural instinct to surrender.
We are looking at a framework that asks you to override your most basic biological instincts.
Right. We are going to dive deep into the actual functional spiritual mechanics of how setbacks operate. And spoiler alert here, they are not dead ends.
Not even close.
We are going to explore how they are, in fact, incredibly precise, highly engineered, divine setups.
Mechanisms designed for growth, for tensile resilience.
Yeah, and for a level of future restoration that your panicked brain literally cannot visualize when you are standing in the middle of the mess.
So to map out this framework, we are drawing on a deeply profound source material.
We are looking specifically at quote 15 from Elder William Moore's book, From Ordinary to Extraordinary, 33 motivational quotes.
And Elder Moore isolates a principle here based on the biblical text of Judges chapter 6, verse 12. His quote states, with just incredible density, every setback acts as a launch pad for recovery.
Every setback acts as a launch pad for recovery. I just keep turning that phrase over and over.
It is so good.
It really is. And to build out the physical and spiritual architecture of this idea, we are going to be looking at a specific blueprint of supporting texts that explain the actual how of that process.
The mechanics of it.
Exactly. We are pulling from Romans chapter 8, verse 28, Proverbs chapter 24, verse 16, Isaiah chapter 40, verse 31, and 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 8 and 9.
That is a powerhouse lineup.
It is. And what gets me so intensely curious about this specific collection of verses is the total narrative shift. I mean, we spend our entire adult lives just trying to survive a setback.
Oh, completely. We just want the pain to stop.
Right. We grit our teeth, we brace for impact, and we just hope we do not lose too much ground.
But these sources are proposing something far more aggressive than that.
They are telling us that we aren't just supposed to survive the collision, we're supposed to metabolize it. We are supposed to utilize it.
It demands that we move the concept of a setback from being this passive experience of suffering into an active instrument of preparation.
Yes. But to really grasp how a setback functions in a spiritual or developmental sense, I feel like we have to ground this in physical reality first.
I agree. We need to dissect the literal engineering concept of what Elder Moore is talking about.
We need to look at what a launch pad actually does in the physical world of physics and aerospace before we can map it onto our internal emotional lives.
So let's unpack the semantics and the physics of this.
Yeah, think about the word setback. Just the very prefix implies a forced, violent, backward or downward motion.
You are being set back.
Exactly. You are losing altitude, losing momentum. You're being pushed into the dirt. It feels inherently regressive.
So pairing that word with launchpad feels like an oxymoron at first glance.
It really does.
Which is what makes Elder Moore's choice of the word launchpad so deliberate and so brilliant.
Unpack that a bit.
Well, think about the physical architecture. The sheer structural engineering required for a literal NASA launch pad.
Okay.
A launch pad is not just a flat piece of concrete poured in a field. It is a highly complex, deeply entrenched platform built specifically to withstand an absolutely catastrophic amount of downward force.
Oh, wow. Yeah, the vibration alone.
Violent kinetic vibration and literal fiery exhaust. I mean, when a rocket prepares to leave the Earth's atmosphere, it doesn't just gently float upward.
Right, it generates millions of pounds of thrust.
Exactly. The launch pad is designed with massive flame trenches and sound suppression water systems to absorb that violent downward energy and redirect it.
So it uses the ground's resistance as the foundational stability required to propel a multi-ton object vertically.
Yes.
So the pad itself only exists to handle the fire. Like, if there was no extreme heat, no violent downward pressure, you wouldn't need a launch pad.
You would just need a driveway.
Right. The pad has to take the burn.
Without a substructure capable of handling that severe, punishing downward pressure, upward propulsion is physically impossible.
It just wouldn't work.
No. If you tried to launch a Saturn V rocket from a regular parking lot, the downward force would just destroy the ground beneath it. It would dig a massive crater, and the rocket would collapse into its own destruction.
That is a terrifying visual.
So when Elder Moore states that every setback acts as the launch pad, we have to translate those physics into spiritual mechanics.
Okay, how does that map over?
In spiritual terms, the crushing downward pressure of a massive disappointment, the intense fiery exhaust of a public failure, the heavy gravity of a delay, that is the exact raw kinetic energy the Creator uses to initiate your vertical growth.
Wow, so the pressure isn't meant to bury you. It's the required friction for propulsion.
Exactly.
Here's where my mind goes trying to visualize this. And it is a dynamic I think anyone who has ever played a sport or picked up a tool can understand. Think about the mechanics of a bow and an arrow.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
If your goal is to launch an arrow forward with lethal precision toward a target 50 yards away, you literally cannot accomplish that without first pulling the arrow backward.
Right.
You have to draw it back toward yourself, moving it in the exact opposite direction of its intended destination.
And as you pull it backward, you are creating intense physical tension in the wood of the bow and the fibers of the string.
Yes. The further back you are pulled, the more uncomfortable the tension gets, but the greater the eventual velocity and kinetic energy.
The backward motion is the non-negotiable prerequisite for the forward acceleration. Without the draw, there is no drive.
But I have to push back on this a little bit because there is a brutal psychological reality we have to address here.
Fair enough. Lay it on me.
That bow and arrow analogy is beautiful in theory. Like, it looks fantastic painted on a mural in a corporate retreat center.
Right. Very motivational.
But when you are the arrow, when you are the one currently going through the divorce or the bankruptcy or the public humiliation, and you are being dragged backward, it does not feel like potential energy.
No, it feels like you are being ripped apart.
Exactly. The tension feels like it's going to snap your mind in half. My brain isn't whispering potential energy, it's screaming we are losing everything.
Yeah. The panic is real.
So, practically speaking, in the trenches of a Tuesday morning panic attack, how do we recognize the difference between an actual disastrous retreat where we are just failing and a divine drawback that is prepping us for a launch?
That is the most raw, honest question a person can ask when they're sitting in the ashes of a collapsed plan. Because the sensation of tension is deeply, undeniably painful.
It really is.
But the difference between a chaotic retreat and a divine drawback lies entirely in assessing whose hands are holding the tension.
Oh, I like that.
Unpack that. When an army is retreating, they are running in terror. The motion is uncontrolled, chaotic, and driven by the environment.
Right.
But when an arrow is being drawn back, it is firmly and securely in the grip of the archer. The backward motion is highly controlled, highly intentional, mathematically calculated, and specifically aimed.
So the determining factor isn't the presence of the backward motion itself, but the presence of the archer.
Yes. It is about the underlying framework of reality you choose to adopt.
If you are going to trust the source material we are investigating today, you are required to adopt the paradigm that your life is ultimately in the hands of a purposeful, intentional creator.
Exactly. Therefore, the backward pull, no matter how violent it feels, is not an accident.
So I would challenge anyone listening right now, whether you are sitting in your car or walking the dog, to look at the specific frustration haunting you today.
Look at the relationship that imploded, or the promotion that was handed to someone less qualified.
Or the creative project that completely flatlined. You have to force your brain to ask a terrifying but liberating question. Is this a solid concrete wall I've slammed into? Or is this actually a subterranean foundation being poured underneath me?
Am I in a crater, or am I on a launch pad?
Man, it requires a massive, almost violent cognitive shift in how you process reality. You have to actively interrogate your own assumptions.
You really do.
You have to stop looking at the downward pressure as a punitive sentence and start looking at it as a mechanical necessity. You have to audibly tell yourself, this setback is not my final destination. It is the necessary tension required for my launch.
But making that cognitive shift is nearly impossible to do in a vacuum. I mean, when your amygdala is hijacked by the trauma of a setback, your peripheral vision narrows.
You just get tunnel vision.
You literally can't see the launch pad because your brain is entirely focused on the smoke and the fire of the immediate crisis.
So how do we break out of that?
Recognizing the launch pad usually requires an outside observer, someone entirely removed from your immediate painful circumstances, to step in and define your reality differently than the evidence currently suggests.
And that brings us perfectly to the foundational text Elder Moore uses to anchor this entire philosophy. Judges chapter 6, verse 12.
Yes. In this text, we see the divine acting as that outside observer, stepping into a situation of absolute failure and defining reality in a way that aggressively contradicts the visible metrics.
Let's dive into the mechanics of Judges 6:12. Now, just to set some boundaries on our exploration here, if you've been joining us for these deep dives over the past year, you know we've previously unpacked the broader historical and military saga of Gideon.
Right, we've covered the fleece, the tactical reduction of his army, the psychological warfare with the pitchers and torches.
Yeah, so we do not need to rehash his entire biography today.
No, our focus today is hyper-targeted.
Yeah.
We are putting a microscope on one specific, highly isolated moment in his timeline. We are looking exclusively at the initial point of contact.
We are freezing the frame right at Judges 6:12. Let's establish the psychological and environmental baseline for this moment. Gideon, along with his entire nation, is in the grip of a massive multi-generational setback.
The Midianites have essentially destroyed their economy.
Yeah, they are impoverished, oppressed, and living in constant fear of violent raids. And Gideon himself is currently hiding out in a wine press.
And a wine press in antiquity isn't a lovely barn.
No, it is an underground pit carved into rock. He is at the bottom of a hole, trying to thresh a tiny, pathetic handful of wheat in secret so it doesn't get confiscated.
He is the absolute embodiment of a scarcity mindset, operating in brokenness, uncertainty, and deep, paralyzing discouragement.
And right into the middle of this dark, claustrophobic pit, the angel of the Lord appears and speaks the sentence to him. "The Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor."
Mighty man of valor. The level of cognitive dissonance in that greeting is staggering.
It is almost laughable.
We really need to sit with the sheer absurdity of that statement given the context. Gideon's lived reality is that he is cowering in a pit. He is defeated.
He is literally letting his fear dictate his geography.
There is zero empirical, observable evidence of valor anywhere in his vicinity.
If we are looking at the data, he's a mighty man of anxiety, a mighty man of tax evasion.
A mighty man of hiding in the dark.
Exactly the opposite of valor.
Yet the divine voice addresses him as a mighty man of valor. This is the core spiritual mechanism of the launchpad in action. The Creator, frequently, almost as a rule, if you study the ancient texts, speaks destiny into environments that appear completely devoid of hope.
Okay, I see.
The critical mechanism here is that when God speaks, he does not merely describe the present circumstance. He is not a journalist reporting on the current state of Gideon's anxiety.
Right.
He is an architect addressing the potential and the ultimate purpose. He is speaking to the finished product, even while the raw material is still shivering in a hole in the ground.
That makes me think of biology, actually, specifically how stem cells function in the human body.
Oh, I love where this is going.
A stem cell on its own is basically a blank slate. It is an undifferentiated, unimpressive little cell with no specific identity. It doesn't know if it's supposed to be a piece of a liver, a muscle fiber, or part of the optic nerve.
It is just waiting for instructions.
Exactly. But then the environment, the chemical signals in the body, sends a message. The signal basically speaks over that blank cell and says, you are a heart cell.
And what happens?
The moment that destiny is spoken over it, the cell begins to rewrite its own internal structure to match the signal it received. The signal doesn't describe what the cell currently is. It dictates what the cell must become.
Wow.
In this scene in Judges, God is acting as that epigenetic signal. Gideon is the blank, terrified stem cell, and God is injecting the signal mighty man of valor.
That biological mechanism maps perfectly onto this spiritual reality. The epigenetic signal forces the cell to reorganize its internal architecture.
Yes.
God calling Gideon a mighty man of valor was God looking at the raw, unformed, terrified material and naming its ultimate function.
So Gideon's current setback, his fear, his poverty, his hiding, was not a disqualifying factor. It was simply the unformed state of the material.
Precisely. God bypasses the trauma of the current setback and speaks directly to the recovery to initiate the transformation.
So let's bring this out of the ancient Near East and right into the room with you right now. I want you to really interrogate your internal monologue.
This is where the rubber meets the road.
When you are standing in the wreckage of your own personal failure, when you are in your own metaphorical underground pit hiding from the consequences of a bad decision, what are you calling yourself?
What labels are you actively applying to your identity?
Because human beings are notoriously harsh critics of themselves. We fail at a startup, and we don't say the business failed. We say, I am a failure.
We go through a brutal divorce, and we say, I am inherently unlovable.
We relapse into a bad habit, and we say, I am broken. We conflate the event with our identity.
We allow the temporary external circumstance to permanently rewrite our internal identity. We let the downward pressure name us.
But the intense challenge presented by Judges 6:12 is to actively reject that naming convention. Are you going to adopt the label of your setback, or are you going to train your ear to listen to the destiny being spoken over you?
That is the choice.
When you feel incredibly weak, when your bank account is overdrawn and your confidence is shattered, can you force yourself to accept the signal calling you a mighty person of valor?
Can you accept the premise that your current state of brokenness does not overwrite your ultimate engineered purpose? It is an agonizingly difficult challenge because it requires us to place our trust in a reality we cannot yet verify with our senses.
We want proof.
We do. We have to trust the signal over the circumstance. But this raises an incredibly practical, mechanical question.
Which is?
We understand the theory of the launch pad, the downward pressure preparing us. We understand the concept of the epigenetic signal God speaking destiny over our brokenness, calling out the potential. But there is a massive functional gap here.
There's a huge gap. Okay, so God sees the potential, and he injects the signal of valor into the middle of the pit. But how does the actual transformation occur?
Right. How do we get from point A to point B?
How do we physically and spiritually get from hiding in the wine press to standing on the launch pad and achieving the recovery? It's one thing to be called a mighty man of valor. It is another thing entirely to actually forge that valor when your life is in absolute pieces.
What are the literal mechanics of taking those shattered fragments and reassembling them into a functioning recovery? To map out that exact mechanism, we look to the next piece of our source material. This text provides the specific blueprint for how that gap is bridged.
Okay.
It outlines the chemical and spiritual mechanics of what we can call divine synthesis. And we find this documented in the book of Romans, chapter 8, verse 28.
Romans 8:28. This verse is so ubiquitous on coffee mugs and bumper stickers that we've almost become completely numb to what it's actually claiming.
It really is everywhere.
It says, God works all things together for good.
Its familiarity is actually its biggest liability, because it is frequently and deeply misunderstood.
Oh, absolutely.
We really need to strip away the cultural gloss and unpack the profound mechanical weight of the phrase works all things together. because there is a highly toxic misconception that needs to be aggressively dismantled here.
You mean the toxic positivity interpretation, the idea that we have to just smile through a tragedy?
Precisely. When an individual goes through a catastrophic setback, the sudden loss of a loved one, a devastating medical diagnosis, a massive financial collapse, inevitably, well-meaning people will deploy this verse as a band-aid.
Oh, I hate that.
They will say, well, God works it all for good, so this terrible thing must actually be a good thing in disguise.
Yes.
That interpretation is not just incredibly damaging to a grieving person, it is textually and linguistically false.
Thank you.
This text does not claim that all things are inherently good. A business failure is not good. A terminal disease is not good. Betrayal is a horrific evil. They're painful, destructive, and they introduce deep chaos into our lives.
So if the verse isn't suggesting that bad things are secretly good things wearing a mask, what is the actual mechanism being described?
The mechanism is synthesis. The original Greek word used here is synergio, from which we get the English word synergy. It means to partner, to labor together, to create a combined effect greater than the sum of separate parts. The text says, he works all things together for good. The emphasis is on the combination, the chemical reaction, not the individual components.
I see.
The Creator uses moments of failure, severe delay, and extreme disappointment as raw, unrefined materials. He takes the painful elements, the shattered expectations, the setbacks, and everything. He actively synthesizes them together with your specific experiences, your acquired skills, and his overarching grace to produce an outcome that ultimately forges your character.
Wow.
The good is found exclusively in the final synthesis, never in the isolated, painful event itself.
Let me ground this in a chemical analogy that we interact with in our kitchens, because this is the best way to visualize Synergio. Think about the complex chemistry of baking a cake from scratch.
Okay, making me hungry.
If I were to put a massive spoonful of dry, raw flour into your mouth, you would choke on it. It is chalky and terrible.
Please don't do that.
If I forced you to drink a raw egg or eat a cup of bitter baking soda or swallow a tablespoon of pure vanilla extract, every single one of those isolated ingredients consumed on their own is repulsive, bitter, or genuinely hard to stomach.
Disgusting.
Those raw ingredients represent the individual setbacks in our lives. The delays, the firings, the rejections. On their own, isolated from the rest of the recipe, they are bitter and terrible.
No rational person wants to eat a cup of baking soda. It is highly alkaline and tastes like soap.
Exactly. But when a master baker takes the flour, the protein of the raw egg, the extreme bitterness of the baking soda, and works them together, creating a batter, and then, crucially, applies intense, prolonged heat.
Which represents the adversity of the launch pad.
Yes.
Mm.
What happens? The heat triggers the Maillard reaction. The baking soda reacts with the acids. The proteins uncoil and trap expanding gases. What comes out of the oven is an incredible, sweet, structurally complex cake.
It is magic.
The baker didn't magically make the baking soda itself taste good. He synthesized it through the application of heat into a masterpiece.
And we cannot ignore the function of the heat in that analogy. Without the extreme temperature of the oven, without the severe pressure of the launch pad, the ingredients never undergo a chemical transformation.
They just stay raw.
They just sit on the counter as a messy bowl of raw, unpalatable components. The synthesis absolutely requires the adversity.
But here is the massive psychological hurdle, and I know this is a question anyone dealing with trauma wrestles with. When you are the one sitting inside the mixing bowl, when you are currently being beaten by the whisk, how do you maintain your sanity and your faith in the baker when you're choking on dry flour?
It is so hard.
When all your nervous system can register is the extreme bitterness of a layoff or the raw, bleeding pain of a breakup, it's practically impossible to imagine the final synthesized cake. Your brain just says everything tastes like ash.
It requires an immense, highly disciplined amount of trust in the baker's recipe, specifically when you have been denied access to the cookbook.
Well,
functionally, it requires a conscious daily decision to stop evaluating the entirety of your life based on the taste of a single ingredient. If you judge your overarching worth, your future trajectory, or your identity based solely on the bitter taste of one isolated failure, you will inevitably spiral into despair.
you just will.
You have to actively intervene in your own thought process and remind yourself of the principle of synergio. You have to look at the wreckage and say, this pain is mathematically real, this setback is deeply bitter, but it is not the final product. It is just one raw material being added to the crucible.
I really want you to absorb that framework. I encourage you to view the timeline of your life as an ongoing, highly complex, slow-cooking recipe.
Just a continuous process.
That painful delay you're trapped in right now, that unexpected failure that absolutely knocked the wind out of you last week, it isn't the final dish. It is not the period at the end of the sentence. It is just one raw material.
And adopting this specific view is what allows you to endure the heat of the oven without losing your mind.
Exactly, because you understand that a chemical transformation is actively occurring in the dark.
And what's truly fascinating is that leaning into this process, genuinely believing that your bitter failures are just ingredients undergoing synthesis, is exactly what generates the sheer irrational audacity a person needs to stand back up after they've fallen flat on their face.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Right. If a fall represents the end of the world, the logical response is to stay down. But if a fall is simply a raw ingredient being loaded onto the launch pad, it loses its power to define you. You can rise.
Which brings our analysis directly to the behavioral output we are expected to demonstrate.
As documented in Proverbs chapter 24, verse 16.
Let's transition to the mechanics of Proverbs 24:16. This verse is incredibly brief, but it completely shatters our modern conceptions of success.
It really does.
It states, "For though the righteous fall 7 times, they rise again."
We need to pause and analyze the staggering paradigm shift this text introduces regarding how we view morality, competence, and resilience.
Okay, let's unpack it.
I want to highlight the core underlying assumption of this verse because it is culturally revolutionary. The text assumes, it practically guarantees as a statistical certainty that the righteous will fall.
Wow.
Notice the grammar. It does not say if they happen to stumble. It says though they fall. And it quantifies it at 7 times, which in ancient Near Eastern literature is a numeric symbol for completeness or a continuing perpetual state.
It implies a chronic, repetitive face planting. That is a massive recalibration of how we judge people. I mean, we have been conditioned to think of falling as the exact opposite of being righteous.
Oh, totally.
We think the good people, the highly successful, the hyper-competent, the righteous, we assume they're the ones who walk a tightrope flawlessly, execute every plan perfectly, and never make a single misstep.
We subconsciously believe that falling is a punishment reserved for the wicked, the lazy, or the foolish. We entirely equate righteousness with an unblemished record. But this specific scripture annihilates that illusion. Falling down, failing publicly, making a catastrophic error in judgment, these are not disqualifiers from your ultimate purpose.
They are part of the process.
They are anticipated, normalized data points in the human experience, even for the most dedicated, hyper-focused, purpose-driven individuals on the planet.
It is unavoidable.
What this text is doing is fundamentally rewriting the definition of what constitutes righteousness in a hostile environment. Righteousness in this operational context is not defined by a flawless record of never failing. It is defined exclusively by the spiritual, mental, and physical tensile strength required to rise again.
So, executing your purpose correctly isn't about avoiding the ground. It's about refusing to let the ground become your permanent address.
It completely normalizes the reality of the setback. It informs you that hitting the concrete is not a signal that you have wandered off the path. Hitting the concrete is frequently the terrain of the path itself.
The path is bumpy.
The sole distinguishing metric of the righteous individual is their upward mobility immediately following the downward pressure, the launch sequence after the setback.
Okay, I have to inject a heavy dose of reality here because I know what it actually feels like to live this out.
Let's hear it.
The concept of rising again sounds incredibly noble on a deep dive, but practically speaking, the physical act of rising again is exhausting.
Oh, it drains everything you have.
It drains your adrenal glands. It takes a massive toll on your cognitive bandwidth. It is one thing to trip on a sidewalk, fall down once, dust off your knees, laugh about it, and keep walking.
Sure.
But it is a completely different psychological torment to fall over and over and over again. What if you are trying to break a deeply ingrained chemical addiction?
Or trying to get a small business off the ground and you faced rejection from 50 investors.
Yes. What if you keep repeating the exact same toxic patterns in your relationships? At what point does the mandate to rise again transition from noble resilience into just blindly, stubbornly walking headfirst into a brick wall?
That is a very thin line.
How do we intellectually distinguish between righteous resilience and sheer, foolish stubbornness?
That is an incredibly complex tension. And honestly, when you are in the middle of it, they feel chemically identical. The frustration is exactly the same.
Right.
but there's a diagnostic tool to tell the difference. The dividing line between righteous resilience and foolish stubbornness is the presence of synthesized learning. Foolish stubbornness is falling down, getting back up, and executing the exact same flawed strategy with the exact same variables, expecting a miraculously different result. That is the definition of hitting the brick wall.
Right, Albert Einstein's definition of insanity.
Righteous resilience, however, is falling down, staying on the ground just long enough to analyze the specific terrain that tripped you, synthesizing that failure as a data point for wisdom, and then rising again with an adjusted strategy.
That makes a lot of sense.
But your point about the sheer exhaustion of this cycle is vital. The text itself acknowledges the heavy, repetitive nature of the struggle by using the number 7. It openly implies a profound, bone-deep weariness.
I want to speak directly to the person who feels that weariness in their marrow right now. Maybe you feel like you are on your 5th, your 8th, or your 10th fall in a highly specific area of your life.
It could be your career trajectory, or maybe it's trying to establish basic healthy habits.
Or maybe it is a grinding daily battle with your mental health, and you are just so tired of starting over.
It is exhausting.
I need you to hear the specific truth clearly. The act of getting back up is the victory. The victory isn't the absence of the struggle. The sheer, stubborn refusal to let the pavement dictate your final status is actively forging the exact neurological and spiritual grit required for your ultimate purpose. The masterpiece is being chiseled every single time you force your weary legs to stand back up.
The repetitive act of rising is what builds the fast-twitch muscle fibers of the soul. Every time you stand up against the heavy gravity of your own failure, your internal architecture gets slightly more robust.
You are getting stronger.
But, as you acutely noted, that process consumes massive amounts of energy. And sometimes, after a particularly severe setback or relentless barrage of smaller ones, our internal reserves are entirely depleted.
We just have nothing left.
We stare at the ground, we logically comprehend that we are supposed to rise, but the fuel tank is running on fumes.
You can memorize all the theoretical frameworks in the world. You can understand launch pads and chemical baking synthesis and epigenetic signals and rising 7 times.
None of it matters if you're empty.
If your internal battery is at 1%, you aren't going anywhere. You are just lying flat on the launch pad, fully aware of what you should do, but completely incapable of executing it.
So true.
So, mechanically speaking, where does the actual energy to rise again come from when our own biological and emotional reserves are empty?
That is the exact logistical crisis the source material anticipates. The texts do not issue a command to rise without simultaneously providing a mechanism for profound replenishment.
Thank goodness.
This leads us to the specific technology of energy renewal documented in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 31.
Let's open up Isaiah 40:31. This is another one of those heavily quoted majestic verses. It reads, "But those who wait upon the Lord will find renewed strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint."
This verse tackles what is arguably the most agonizing, psychologically torturous phase of any setback: the delay, the waiting period.
The worst part.
It addresses the liminal transitional space between the initial devastating fall and the eventual promised recovery. You have hit the ground, you know you need to rise, but the launch sequence hasn't initiated yet.
You are just stuck.
You're just sitting idle on the pad, surrounded by the smoke of your failure. And the text reveals that the mechanism for finding the strength to finally rise is hidden inside how we operate during that specific period of waiting.
The waiting room of life.
Yeah.
The ultimate test of patience.
No one likes it.
We are a culture conditioned for immediate, frictionless resolution. We want Amazon Prime delivery on our spiritual breakthroughs.
We want the instant launch,
Yeah.
absolutely. But to understand the mechanics here, we have to do a deep dive into the linguistic root of the word waiting used in this scripture, because the English translation strips it of all its power.
Oh, fascinating. What is the original word?
When modern people think of waiting, we envision a highly passive, idle, powerless state. We picture sitting at a bus stop, staring blankly at our phones, killing time, doing absolutely nothing of value until the bus finally arrives. But the original Hebrew word used in Isaiah is quava. And quava is not a passive verb. Its literal physical translation means to bind together, like twisting individual threads to form a thick cord or a rope.
Oh, wow.
In spiritual and psychological terms, quava is an intensely active state of tension. It is the active daily binding of your mind, your will, and your trust to the Creator. It is an intentional intertwining.
So it is not just killing time.
It uses the delay, this excruciating waiting period, not to punish you, but to provide the friction necessary to weave those threads together, increasing your tensile strength.
Let me use a modern technological analogy that we all interact with constantly to explain this act of waiting. Think about the lithium-ion battery in your smartphone.
Okay.
When your phone's battery indicator turns red and it hits 2%, you are forced to plug it into the wall. Now, while it is plugged in, the phone isn't doing nothing.
It looks like it is.
Right. To the naked eye, it might look like it's just sitting there passively, uselessly on your nightstand. You can't use it to scroll social media, you can't record a video, you can't be productive with it while it's executing a deep charge cycle. It feels completely incapacitated.
Sure.
But internally, at a chemical level, an incredibly vital, highly active process is occurring. The lithium ions are literally moving back to the anode. It is actively receiving and storing the power it requires to function later.
Ah, I see.
If you refuse to let it sit on the charger, if you get impatient and keep unplugging it to send a quick text, the battery will eventually degrade and completely die. The delay, the forced time it spends tethered to the wall, is actually a vital, non-negotiable period of capacity building.
That perfectly illustrates the mechanics of Kava.
Yeah.
The charging station is not a penalty box. It is an infrastructural necessity for future output.
It is mandatory.
When you are forced into a brutal season of waiting after a major setback, you are being tethered to the source. The delay is not evidence that God is ignoring you. It is evidence that God is charging you.
He is expanding your capacity.
Exactly. He is expanding your internal spiritual capacity so that when you finally do ignite and launch off that pad, you possess the sustained energy reserves required to maintain the altitude of your recovery.
So I have to ask you, how are you currently interpreting your season of delay? Are you looking at the holding pattern in your career, or the agonizing wait for a medical result, or the slow, painful process of healing from a heartbreak as a punishment?
Do you feel like you've been benched because you failed?
Or can you force your brain to reframe it and see it as a charging station? I want to urge you to radically reinterpret your waiting period.
It is a game changer.
If you can view this dark, quiet time as an active opportunity for Quava, for binding your threads to the source, for spiritual and emotional strengthening, you are actually inoculating yourself against future burnout. You are quietly gathering the massive energetic reserves you will desperately need when your breakthrough finally arrives.
Because here's the profound, somewhat sobering truth that connects all these mechanics together. Once you have acquired that renewed strength from the waiting period, once the battery is fully charged and you finally experience the massive kinetic launch off that pad, you realize a hard truth.
Uh-oh.
That immense strength wasn't given to you just so you could finally coast into an easy, comfortable, resistance-free existence.
But that is the illusion we all fall for. We think the breakthrough, the recovery, means the end of all struggle. We think we finally arrive at the beach.
We deeply crave the beach.
We do.
But the renewed strength detailed in Isaiah is infused into your system specifically so you can withstand the extreme, crushing atmospheric pressures of actually fulfilling your true massive destiny.
Wow.
In aerospace, the higher the rocket climbs, the more atmospheric drag and pressure it encounters. The deeper you go into your life's actual purpose, the more intense the resistance will become.
It never stops.
Which perfectly and somewhat ruthlessly sets up the final piece of our source material, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 8 and 9.
Let's examine 2 Corinthians 4, 8 through 9. This is the Apostle Paul writing, a man who experienced shipwrecks, beatings, and imprisonment.
He knew a thing or two about setbacks.
He says, "We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed."
This passage serves as the ultimate unfiltered reality check of the human experience. It flatly refuses to sugarcoat the journey.
Paul is just laying it out there.
Paul is documenting the absolute, undeniable reality of prolonged adversity. He is openly admitting that pursuing a divine purpose involves being constantly pressed and perplexed.
You'll be squeezed by economic realities.
You'll be deeply confused by people's actions. You will face overwhelming, seemingly insurmountable odds. That is the baseline reality of the terrain.
But then he introduces the most profound structural caveat in the text. Not destroyed, pressed, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, struck down meaning you hit the pavement, but not destroyed. It's like he is fully acknowledging the severity of the downward pressure of the setback, but boldly declaring that the pressure mathematically cannot achieve its ultimate goal of obliterating him.
The underlying engineering concept here is structural integrity. Setbacks are essentially stress tests applied to our structural integrity.
Okay.
They apply maximum distributed pressure to our minds, our nervous systems, and our faith. And what Paul is arguing is that through this specific multi-stage process, through surviving the launch pad, undergoing the chemical synthesis of Romans 8, developing the repetitive resilience of Proverbs, and executing the active kava of Isaiah, God actively forges a structural integrity within us that is exponentially more resilient than we ever calculated.
That is incredible.
The external pressure merely proves the perfection of the internal design.
Let me offer an engineering analogy that perfectly visualizes this dynamic of external pressure versus internal structural integrity.
Please do.
Think about the fluid dynamics and engineering of a deep-sea submersible, the kind designed to descend into the Marianas Trench.
Those things are amazing.
Those titanium spheres are designed specifically to operate in the darkest, coldest, most violently high-pressure environments on the entire planet. When that submarine is 7 miles deep in the ocean, the sheer weight of the water column above it is generating millions of pounds of external pressure per square inch.
It is unfathomable.
The environment is relentlessly trying to violently implode the hull from every conceivable angle.
The external environment is the definition of hostile. It is constantly probing for a weakness.
Relentlessly hostile.
Yeah.
The pressure outside is immense, freezing, and constant. But, and here is the absolute genius of the engineering, because of its internal spherical design, because the titanium hull was forged in extreme heat to withstand it, and because the internal pressurization pushes back outward against the external weight, the submarine is not crushed.
It holds up.
It is literally hard-pressed on every side by the ocean, but it is not destroyed. And here is the beautiful takeaway. The extreme violent adversity of the external ocean does not dictate the internal reality of the people sitting inside the submarine. They are safe, they are breathing oxygen, and they are successfully exploring the deep, despite the crushing pressure trying to end them.
That captures the precise physics of 2 Corinthians 4. The pressure is a reality. The water is incredibly heavy.
But your internal design.
But your internal design, which has been forged by God through the painful synthesis of your setbacks, is stronger than the external weight trying to crush you.
I want to remind you of this exact mechanical truth. Feeling immense, terrifying pressure in your life right now does not mean you are failing.
It really doesn't.
It doesn't mean your submarine is springing a leak. In fact, feeling that level of pressure usually indicates that you are no longer playing in the safe, comfortable shallows. It means you are actively operating in the deep, dangerous waters of your true potential.
The deeper you go into your calling, the further you progress in your recovery, the more atmospheric pressure you will encounter.
I urge you to lean heavily into this framework. The pressure you are feeling on your chest is real, it is heavy, and it is completely exhausting.
But so is your unbreakable design in the hands of the master engineer.
You are built for the deep.
You are structurally engineered for the deep. And that realization truly brings us to the grand synthesis of every concept we've unpacked in this session.
It really ties it all together.
If we zoom out and look at the entire architecture of this framework, it reveals a perfectly connected, highly sequential spiritual mechanism.
It is a complete functioning system. We started with Elder Moore's foundational physics from, quote, 15, establishing the reality that every setback is fundamentally a launch pad, requiring extreme downward pressure to generate upward momentum.
We then explored how to cognitively activate that launch pad. It begins by allowing the Creator's epigenetic signal, as demonstrated in Judges with Gideon, to speak destiny, valor, and potential into our darkest, most broken environments.
Naming the final masterpiece long before the chiseling is complete. From there, we mapped out the chemical mechanics of Romans 8:28, understanding that while God doesn't author the tragedy, he acts as the master chemist, utilizing synergio to actively synthesize all our bitter failures and raw traumas into a complex master plan for good.
Which subsequently injects us with the sheer irrational grit outlined in Proverbs 24:16. It gives us the empirical audacity to redefine the very nature of righteousness, understanding that even if we hit the pavement 7 times, the ultimate victory is secured in the muscle memory of rising again.
And when our biological and spiritual batteries are completely drained by that rising, we leverage the technology of Isaiah 40:31.
We don't fight the delay.
We plug into the active, intertwining friction of kava, allowing the waiting period to renew our strength so we don't catastrophically burn out during the ascent.
all of which culminates in the undeniable pressure-tested reality of 2 Corinthians 4. The initial preparation, the painful chemical synthesis, the repetitive rising, and the deep charging all combine to forge the internal structural integrity necessary to survive the crushing depths.
It ensures that while we will absolutely be pressed on every side by life demands, our hull will never be breached.
I want to offer a final, grounded reassurance to you as we wrap up today. I don't know the specific details of the heavy, suffocating reality you are carrying today.
Nobody does.
Whatever catastrophic setback you are staring at, whether it is a devastating career collapse, a deeply painful moral failing, a shattered family dynamic, or an agonizing years-long delay in your hopes, I want you to hear the unified consensus of this ancient source material.
This is not your final defeat.
Your amygdala is lying to you. It feels like a terminal end, but it is a highly calculated divine setup. The pressure you feel in your chest is just the tension of the bowstring drawing back. You are actively being prepped for a massive kinetic launch.
I want to leave you with one final, lingering image to turn over in your mind as you go about the rest of your week. Something that visualizes everything we've dissected today, but from a slightly different angle.
Okay, lay it on us.
Think about the physical characteristics of a tiny, dormant apple seed, and think about a wooden coffin. When you analyze them purely from the outside, utilizing only external metrics, their circumstances are practically identical.
Both of them are violently buried in the dark.
Both of them are pushed down deep under heavy, suffocating layers of dirt. Both of them are completely cut off from the light of the sun, seemingly the helpless victims of a massive downward pressure.
If you just look at the dirt, they both look dead.
But the only functional difference between a tragic burial and a purposeful planting is the genetic potential for life hidden inside. I want you to look closely at the specific setback you are currently buried under, the heavy dirt of your disappointment and failure. Have you been walking around calling it a grave, mourning a final defeat, when all along the Creator has been treating it as a garden? Keep leaning into the friction of the process, trust the terrifying tension of the launch pad, stay deeply, relentlessly curious.
Thank you for joining us today on From Manuscript to Ministry. If today's featured book encouraged, challenged, or inspired you, we invite you to take the next step, purchase a copy, and support the author behind the message. When you invest in their work, you're not just buying a book, you're sowing into good ground and helping advance the kingdom of God through faith-filled storytelling. Don't forget to subscribe, follow, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who needs it. Your support helps these powerful voices reach even further. Until next time, keep reading, keep writing, keep praying, and keep walking boldly in your calling. God is still turning manuscripts into ministries.